Workloads protected by VMware are the safest workloads in the multi-cloud. Private cloud, public cloud, any cloud. Stronger, with distributed protection to the API and everything east-west, inside, and cross-cloud. Stronger, with 3 layers of detection, trusting nothing and seeing everything, even the best hidden bad actors. Stronger, with an SE Labs AAA certified advanced NDR that brings the multi-cloud together for the win. You've got workloads, we've got security. VMware Security. Simply stronger. Visit securityweekly.com/VMware to learn more. Attackers are only getting more proficient, so how can you proactively adapt your cybersecurity strategy? Core Security by Help Systems helps you uncover and prioritize the risks that pose the biggest threat to your organization. Core Impact is a penetration testing tool that safely finds and exploits vulnerabilities using the same techniques as attackers. You can conduct advanced pen tests with ease using certified exploits and automations. Take your engagements to the next level by pairing with Cobalt Strike, a threat emulation tool ideal for adversary simulations and red team operations. Learn more at securityweekly.com/core security.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover in one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. All right, for our second interview today, we are talking to Dr. Sharon Goldberg about putting the zero back in Zero Trust. I know what you're thinking. Zero Trust, pass, but it'll be a fun chat, I promise. And Sharon has quite the CV. She is a tenured professor at Boston University and has published nearly 36 peer-reviewed papers. She can go deep on security related to BGP, DNS, NTP, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and cryptography standards. So it tickled me that we have a rare expert here on Security Weekly that can talk about both kinds of crypto. And Tyler, you're forbidden for jumping into cryptocurrency stuff because that's not the topic for today. That would take up the whole show. But welcome to the show, Sharon.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Really, really excited about this conversation since we chatted before the show. You've worked on some fascinating stuff. So maybe we can kind of start there with a bit of your background, how you came to be founding Bastion Zero, a company focused on Zero Trust.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm a professor at BU. I actually started my career quite a long time ago. I was a telecom engineer at a power company. That was my first job. And then I went and did my PhD. And during my PhD, I discovered cryptography, but I was actually not a very good cryptographer because at that time, I guess almost 15, 17 years ago, cryptographers were theoretical computer scientists, and I'm really an engineer. So I ended up kind of getting into infrastructure security kind of early. And that's why I worked on BGP, NTP, DNS, all the core internet protocols from a cryptographic point of view. So that's kind of where I come from academia, but really focused on the internet's plumbing. What happened was after I got tenure, I started getting interested in cryptocurrency and working on stuff related to Bitcoin and Ethereum. And then I actually started a blockchain company. And then what happened was COVID actually hit. And when COVID hit, we had a lot of problems. And so what happened then was we actually founded Bastion Zero out of the ashes of our cryptocurrency company. And that's where we are today. And so, yes, I am like both crypto means cryptography and crypto means cryptocurrency. I guess I would say both. I'm more on the crypto means cryptography side of the house right now. And I guess like the way to think about what we're doing at Bastion Zero is we're taking some of these ideas that are so common in cryptography and cryptocurrency and really bringing them into the cloud security space in a way that hasn't really been done. And I'll just make it very, very simple. Like in the world I come from, it's very unusual to kind of put all your keys in one place, like put them all in one database or in one SaaS or in one a hardware token or something like this. The idea is like just spread apart your sensitive credentials across many different locations. And it's very unusual to actually see that type of architecture in the cloud security world. And so that's actually what we're building at Bastion Zero, like a way of managing access and credentials that doesn't rely on putting everything in one single point of compromise, one single trusted authority that attackers can go after. And that's actually what our cryptocurrency company was doing way back. We just kind of moved the technology into another industry that we were really more familiar with. So that's the founding story.
When you say credentials, are you talking about like single sign-on or OAuth or SAML tokens? Like kind of what's the details around like how that's happening?
Yeah, so I am actually talking about SSO and OpenID Connect and SAML and all those things that you mentioned. So basically, the specific thing that Bastion Zero is focused on is infrastructure access. So how do people gain access into your infrastructure? Those people being your engineers, not adversaries, but the actual employees of the company. I remember in the last segment you were talking about not having a hard, crunchy outside and a soft, chewy center to your infrastructure. That's exactly where we're focused. Like when your engineers need to get into a Linux server or into a Kubernetes cluster or into a database because something has happened, how do they get in? And how do you make sure that vector of entry, which is supposed to be there for your actual engineering team to use, how do you make sure that vector of entry doesn't become a disaster that causes your whole infrastructure to get owned? That's where we're sitting. A lot of companies today do that with single sign-on, right? And so what we're saying at Bastion Zero is like single sign-on is great, but you really don't want to have a single point of compromise where your SSO provider kind of, if it gets owned, your whole network gets owned, your whole infrastructure gets owned. How do you build a system that's not so sensitive to the party that's authorizing people to actually access the infrastructure?
That's pretty awesome. Are you guys also handling that for like proxying the connections or API key management, the other things that, typical cloud infrastructure mistakes are kind of crumbling at?
Yeah. So, I think the way to think about this is if you have a cloud, if you have cloud infrastructure and you have all these SSH keys that your engineers are using to access servers, you have maybe Kubernetes credentials, maybe you have long-lived IAM roles that people have. We come in and we eliminate all of that human-managed, all the credentials that humans need to have in order to access the infrastructure. And we replace that with our access system, which actually allows you to close all the ports. No more SSH ports open, no more VPN ports open, take your Kubernetes APIs off the internet, kind of close all those ports and have all those credentials be issued ephemerally, like sort of when someone logs in, so they're not sitting around in your machine where they can get stolen. But the next step is to take it like to the level you're describing, which is like when one machine talks to the other, you want to make sure that you're also controlling that access. And we don't do that right now, but that is actually something we're working on this year, but we don't have that kind of support. So ultimately what you want to have is you want to have sort of a framework where like, if anyone is talking to a machine, they're going through a very controlled authentication, policy check, logging, and then only then can they have access rather than just kind of like handing out SSH keys and letting people use them or handing out VPN credentials and letting people use them.
I normally have to ask a bunch of questions to tease out all those details, but I think you've answered almost every question I was going to ask. So I think we're done now.
Okay, good. So thanks, everyone. I have more to say. I'm somewhat joking. I appreciate that you hit all those points so quickly, because that is I think it is important for people to understand, that there is an option to not have ports hanging out on the public internet, that can just be brute forced and beat up. We've seen just so much low-hanging fruit taken advantage of, whether it's MongoDB or Redis or, just SSH all over the place, and nobody monitoring that stuff. That, when I first saw, I still think of this stuff kind of as software-defined perimeter, which is kind of an old, I think Vitter came up with that term maybe in some of the early work that they did, but now it's, I don't know, how would you categorize? How does Gartner categorize you? They don't. We don't fit into a category right now. So it's interesting. We actually just announced our financing today, and my quote that's kind of made the rounds is like, I think we're part of a new category that combines VPNs, bastion hosts, and privilege access management. So that's my answer to that question. So we do a lot of things that like a PAM would do, like something like a CyberArk would do. But it's also, we also actually do the access control, like how do you actually connect into the targets. So it's kind of a combination of like a VPN replacement and a PAM, where the idea is like PAMs usually, privilege access management usually controls like who has access to the admin credentials on this machine, right? And VPN controls like how do you get into the network. We kind of do both. So it's like you specify that I should have access to admin on this specific machine, and Bastion Zero will facilitate that connection. And there's actually like kind of a growing class of products that do this. And the reason that this is cool is actually partially because of the issue of open ports, like you were describing, because like kind of the modern way of dealing with connectivity into infrastructure is actually not to have users like dialing into the targets. Like I should not be making an incoming connection to a Linux machine. The Linux machine should actually have all its ports closed, but I should still be able to get in. And the way you actually build a system like that is to actually have the Linux machine connect into some sort of cloud service or some sort of other service, and then have the users connect into that same service, and the service in the middle patching together the connection. And that way you can have all the ports closed. And so that service kind of is the only place that these Linux machines are talking to, right? And in that way, you can avoid a lot of the like wonderful stuff we've seen with crypto jacking on SSH ports and like the RDP, all the RDP infiltration attacks that we've seen, because those ports are just closed, right? All those machines are just talking to like one specific place on the internet, and that's what's facilitating access to them.
And all that attack surface goes away.
That's
Go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to say congratulations on the funding. That's wonderful. What kinds of companies are you targeting? Who are the early adopters of this? Like you said, it sort of merges a couple of categories, and our listeners, everybody's sort of, it's human nature to want to lump technologies together, but who are you seeing both in terms of types of companies as well as who within the company is generally most interested and is an early adopter of your solution?
Yeah, so I have a bunch of POCs live right now that I can't talk about, but there is a list of companies and customers we have on our website right now that I can mention, which include AppQs, Paidy, which is a fintech that was recently bought by PayPal, and a couple of others. But I will say that it's been very interesting. I'm a startup CEO now. I kind of run sales for my company. As you know, I'm really a technologist. I'm not a salesperson at all. But what's really interesting is that we made the decision to actually go after younger companies that are smaller, because what we saw was when we went into the bigger enterprises that were, around 15, 20 years, and there was like big teams, the technology stack looked completely different than what it looked like at a younger organization. And so we wanted to be working with teams that had sort of a more modern infrastructure, like using Kubernetes or using Linux and not using Windows and RDP, the type of databases that a younger organization uses versus an older organization. It's just a choice that we made because we can't really build everything. With our product, the idea is that we're controlling access directly into specific roles on the target. So, an account on a Linux machine, or a role on a Kubernetes cluster, or an account on a database, right? So we kind of have to build all those pieces. So we have to be really picky about like what type of technology stacks we're building for. So that's what we're doing specifically at Bastion Zero right now. And it allows us to kind of like pull together like VPNs and PAMs, because these small organizations generally don't use PAMs. Like they don't even know what a PAM is for the most part. So this is all kind of like new and cool for them to be able to have, but they do know what a VPN is, right? I will say though, that I think that this type of problem exists across all sorts of companies. One of the reasons that we're having this conversation is because the federal government put out a memo around their transition to zero trust, and a lot of what we're doing fits like directly into that memo. Our customers are not the federal government. I don't know if they ever will be, because of FedRAMP and all kinds of things that one has to do in order to work with the federal government. But I think it sort of applies across the stack. Maybe another way of looking at what we're doing now is like the idea of privilege access management, like the future version of this just trickled down into a more manageable tool that kind of is easier to deploy and buy, right? Because privilege access management is quite a heavy thing, and a lot of organizations don't have it, right?
Katie?
Excellent. No more questions. That was a great overview. Thank you.
I am kind of curious around that single point of entry, like closing down your footprint makes it really difficult for attackers. Like what you're doing is exactly like how we fix a lot of the issues we have. What are some of the security measures and things that will have to be put in place in order to protect that single point of entry? I mean, we probably already commonly have, the MFA. We've got different levels of, API access and control, as well as maybe conditional access, IP space. Like what kind of protections are you guys putting around that entry point?
So that is like such a great question, because like, if you think about the architecture I described all of these machines on this side attaching to some sort of point of entry, and then all of these humans on the other side attaching to that same point of entry. So if you look at that, and that point of entry would be right here, that is a pretty powerful thing, right? That point of entry has a lot of control over what happens to your systems. And if you think about your own cloud architectures right now, that may be like examples of such a point of entry could be a Bastion host, right? It could be my company's cloud service. It could be some other tool you put in place. But that entry point is a really big deal. It's a big security risk because everything goes right through it. And actually, you have to sort of, that is really where actually we focused all of our cryptographic energy. I mentioned that, we have like my team and I, my co-founder and I met at BU. He also has a PhD in cryptography and information security. All of my engineers, or like half of them, have taken my class, taken crypto at BU. We're all sort of out of BU, right? We're very actually worried about that point of entry and what kind of risks it creates for customers. The trend in the industry right now is basically to put that point of entry in a cloud service and then get a SOC 2 certification or an ISO certification, provide that to your customers, and then tell them to just trust you. That is what most vendors do. That is not what we do, even though we do have the SOC 2 certification. We say that actually our cloud service, which is going to be that point of entry into all of your infrastructure, our cloud service actually cannot compromise your targets. And we did a lot of work to make this possible. The way we do this is we have this notion of multiple roots of trust. So instead of just trusting our cloud service to decide like which human can access which target, we actually have more than one root of trust that's participating in that decision. And in particular with Bastion Zero, it's a combination of our cloud service and your SSO provider. So if you use G Suite, if you use Azure AD, if you use Okta, whatever it is, we'll integrate against your identity provider. And actually targets themselves, like your Linux boxes, your clusters, your databases, they'll be checking against that identity provider to make sure that whoever's trying to get into to that target really should be allowed to get in. And so to make a long story short, you need the combination of our cloud service and the identity provider to both agree before a human can actually access a target, right? And so in that way, if our cloud service is hacked, as long as, let's say, your Okta isn't hacked, then the target still won't accept the connection. We actually don't have the ability to access targets without a valid user logging in. And so there's all this crypto that we built to actually accomplish this. And that's why, like, when we were talking about the name of the segment, we talked about like putting the zero back in zero trust, right? Like the majority of solutions that talk about zero trust infrastructure access or zero trust anything, they have some sort of point of entry that's making all the decisions, right? So it's not really zero trust. It's like 100% trust in that point of entry. And what we wanted to do was like build a system that did have a point of entry, but you didn't have to trust it 100%. You could have a compromise of the point of entry and not have the security of the whole system fall apart. And that's what we did at Bastion Zero. And it was really interesting. I guess the last thing I'll say is like, because we're all geeks and cryptographers, we really wanted to build this. We weren't really sure if anyone would care in the market, but we decided to build it anyway, because that's what you do when you're a startup. And it turns out that people actually do care. So I'm very happy about that. But we didn't know that was how it was going to go when we started building this thing.
Yeah, no, that is a constant conversation that I see in some of the chats that I have with CISOs, and I see CISOs having with each other. Third-party risk management is just such a huge, weighty problem. And it used to be. I think there maybe was a period when they're like, we'll trust an AWS service or something like that, and people realized, that there was some shared responsibility there. But certainly for something like this, when you're, potentially a man in the middle target, like I've seen some vendors entirely like avoid putting this kind of technology into their product, and try and find ways around it to where maybe the customer runs it on their end or something like that, where they just do not want to be, they don't want to tackle this problem. They don't want to be that product. So it's cool to see that you not only accepted the challenge, but turned it into a product as well.
I mean, I have so much to say about this because it's very interesting, because one of the ways that people mitigated this risk, right? Like everybody is concerned if you have a point of entry into your infrastructure, that point of entry is got to be highly secure, right? We've always had these architectures in cloud security. They're called bastion hosts. They're called jump hosts. If you go read like some of these compliance frameworks that I'm sure like lots of your listeners have read, they actually require you to have bastion hosts in certain situations, right? So we are like very familiar of this point of entry that can become a single point of compromise. And so like what's happened in the industry has been like one of two things. One is people will say, I'm going to self-host this thing, right? Because I want to own all the risk myself. I don't want to be reliant on a third-party vendor. I don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're not secure enough. I'm going to host it myself, right? Or even go even further, like I'm going to build it from scratch myself, right? And that's what happened for the last, 15 years, right? What happened though, like building that thing yourself is nice, but it starts to get really complicated. And then, you may end up like in that thing that you've self-hosted or built yourself. Maybe you have a certificate authority that controls access to all of your targets. And if, you're probably familiar with certificate authorities, they have one signing key so that if you steal that signing key, you can impersonate the certificate authority and basically issue tokens for anything you want. Right. So hosting a certificate authority yourself is really scary. Right. And so people thought, okay, you know what, this is scary. Let's do it in a SaaS. Maybe someone else can manage the risk for me better. And so people are kind of given this choice, right? Of like, am I going to host it myself and take on all the risk myself? And like, I believe that I can handle all this risk. Or do I want to give it to a third party vendor and like just trust them to do it? Right. And that's been the choice. Right. And what we're saying is like, no, don't make that choice. Like give it to a third-party vendor, but you don't have to trust us fully with the risk because we've created a second root of trust, which is Okta or which is G Suite or whatever you're using for identity management, identity providing, that we don't control and you don't control. And now you've sort of distributed the risk, from one third-party vendor to another, from yourself, from one third-party vendor to like this architecture where you have these two different places that your adversary has to attack in order to actually own your infrastructure. So yeah, that's what's new. And that's what I was so excited about, like building this company, because when we started building it, like there's not much like this in cloud security. For those of you who are familiar with cryptocurrency, there's tons of stuff like this in cryptocurrency. If you look at what's called multi-sigs or multi-signatures in any sort of blockchain protocol, this is a really common architecture in that industry, but like super uncommon in the cloud security industry. So we thought that was like a really interesting opportunity. And that's sort of how this whole thing started.
Yeah, it's a great background, great story. And I just want to check with you on time. I want to make sure that, we let you go before you have to really be somewhere. But I do want to touch on that White House memo as well.
Let's go. Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. So backing up a bit, I think I first became aware of Bastion Zero because, that White House memo came out and they're better than they used to be, but nobody really wants to read a White House memo word for word. But you did it for us. That post went viral. I saw it and read it. In fact, I didn't realize I hadn't put two and two together until we were preparing for this interview. And then I realized, you're that author of that post that I read. So I put those two together. But yeah, I think what really struck me, talking about them being better than they used to be, what really struck me is kind of how bold and, I think a bit more, like emerging tech, almost leaning that way more than we expect the federal government to be kind of on the laggard side of technology in general. So, I feel you had a similar impression. it seemed like.
Yeah, I was like, honestly, I was blown away while I was reading it. I was sitting there and I was like in my living room. It was like 6 p.m. There was so much noise. Everyone was like making noise. And I was like, I cannot believe what I'm reading here. Because it was so far beyond, like, I spend all my day talking to cloud security people. That's like all I do. And it was like it was further beyond what I saw, even the best teams at sort of like the most advanced organizations. Like it was kind of where those teams were, not even the like A-, but the A or the A+, the A+ teams. And there were a couple of things in there that like blew me away. So first thing is it starts with the federal government can no longer depend on perimeter-based defenses. And then it kind of goes and starts tearing up VPNs all the way through the memo. At one point, it even says that internal applications should be accessible over the public internet or something like this. I'm paraphrasing, but what that means is like, don't put your intranet applications intranet behind the VPN. Just put them on the internet. And make sure that the security of those applications is good enough so that they can be on the public internet. So that's really interesting, right? Like they're really coming out strongly against VPNs, and there's this sort of theme in there that they talk about, which is like, don't log into networks, log into targets. So network-based authentication or like IP-based decision-making is no longer good enough. They really want to see people and agencies like controlling access to individual applications, individual targets. And then when I saw that, I was like, wow, like this is what we're doing at Bastion Zero. And I'm still talking, I'm still having conversations with people who have VPNs and they're telling me, well, I have a VPN, so it's all good. And like, here's this, and it, maybe it is, but here's this memo that's like completely what I've been trying to like, talk about for the last 2 years. And there it is from the federal government. So within like 4 hours, I'd written this blog post, and there's all kinds of other stuff in the blog post, but I was just so excited when I was writing it and finished it at like 11 p.m. And then it went viral the next morning.
Yeah, I mean, all the best blog posts I think are written like that. Just in this fire of passion of just, oh my God. And I know I've written a few like that. And the timing was perfect when you got it out. Everybody was just kind of like, I don't want to read yet another executive order after the huge one they released last year, which was I think had 8 or 9 sections. But I certainly get the impression that there are some smart folks at CISA, some smart folks at the White House that realize that like a baby step approach to improving security, at least in the federal space, just it isn't going to get them anywhere. There's no value in doing that. So I was kind of on the fence wondering like, is this really smart, or is it almost borderline naive to think that any government agencies can make this big of a leap?
Yeah, it's going to be hard. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there that's very, very hard to do and to build. So like moving away from VPNs and having all your applications have their own authentication system, it mandates the use of single sign-on pretty much for everything. It requires multi-factor authentication to be turned on for a lot of things, which, is like a normal thing to do these days, except that it also says that TOTP authentication, like, the codes that you get from your phone, that's actually not good enough. They want to see hardware keys. So they've deprecated TOTP, which is really the state of the art right now in most organizations. They're saying, no, we're going to use hardware keys for MFA. The other thing they said, which was like really goes beyond what most organizations do right now, they want to see device context. So they want to know that like you've logged in from a laptop that they recognize and not from something they've never seen. That means that you have to manage your endpoint devices, which is really hard for most orgs to do, and like even more hard when everyone's remote and all over the place. So there's like a lot of stuff in there that goes like one step beyond what most organizations do. I would say that most organizations have MFA turned on in most places, but not necessarily with hardware keys, right? And most organizations do have like logins to things, but is everything behind single sign-on? Not always, right? So there's like a bunch of things in there. And then it goes even one step further where it starts talking about sending like your DNS traffic should be encrypted. Like you can't even do that on AWS today, right? So it's like things that just don't even necessarily exist from in the vendor ecosystem right now. They're sort of like mandating. And I think what they're trying to do with that type of thing is really force vendors and cloud providers to start building out like some of these security protocols that they've been on the fence for a while, like encrypted DNS and things like that.
Yeah, I think your timing is perfect too, because again, some of the conversations I'm hearing, on the enterprise side, is that MFA is pretty easy for them. On the employee side, the internal applications, SaaS applications, stuff like that is pretty easy to enforce and to turn on. But where they're really struggling is more with the admin side of things. The infrastructure. Even infrastructure to infrastructure communication, and then administrators working with infrastructure, is one of the places that they're really struggling with multi-factor, and they end up having gaps and stuff like that in their access to things.
Yeah, it's not like a switch you can pull. There's usually some sort of infrastructure you have to build, or you have to build some sort of tooling of yourself, or use a product like ours. Like it's not sort of necessarily easy to do. I see all kinds of things. I see people putting their own home built YubiKey infrastructure onto specific machines. But for the most part, you don't necessarily see the MFA there, like on the back end. It is something that's just not like easy to turn on at this time.
So, anything we haven't, I just want to open the floor for you. Anything we haven't mentioned that you wanted to talk about? I know you mentioned that you just publicized your raise today, which while you were talking, I added to our show notes for the news segment, which is coming up next. But anything else that we missed that you really wanted to put out there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, thank you for asking. I think I'm very excited right now about the whole direction that this is taking and the industry is taking. I think that there is a big thing that's happening, at least amongst smaller companies and companies that have kind of grown organically, which is a confluence of several things. First of all, a lot of organizations are growing very, very quickly right now, like doubling their number of engineers, or onboarding a lot of engineers, or bringing in teams from abroad that are now accessing sort of their back end. So it's much harder to control who has access to what in your back end these days. And the other thing that's happening is just this sort of explosion of ransomware, which sort of chilled out a little bit recently. But in any case, it's still, an issue when you think about open ports, SSH, things like RDP, things like VPN credentials. Like that is something that cloud teams and security teams worry about a lot. So you've got this like confluence of like growth to engineering teams and risk associated with the access that engineering teams have. And so what's happening right now, I see, is that a lot of people who are charged with managing the backend and the security of the backend don't really know what's going on and who's logging in and how they're getting in and what they're doing when they're logging in, right? And so that's the type of thing that you typically solve with a PAM, like with a privilege access management system, and things that most smaller companies don't have. So I actually think it's a really great time for this sort of category that's being created, because just having a VPN in front of your infrastructure isn't really enough if you don't know what your engineers are doing once they've gotten past the VPN, right? There's just sort of too much risk there. And so I've talked to a lot of teams lately about like, how do you get better handle on that? How do you get visibility into what people are doing? How do you control what people are doing? And not just sort of like have this blindness of like what's going on in your back end, because that's like the worst thing if you're supposed to be managing the security of the back end.
Yeah. No, this is all good stuff. I also want to mention that you do have a free version of your product, up to 3 users, 10 remote servers, it says here. So I like that you have a free tier, because this is exactly the kind of thing I like to running a couple labs, between a couple people here. Me and Tyler have even done some stuff together between our labs. This is very handy for that kind of use case. I think on the smaller end of things. But this is all great. Thanks so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today, Sharon.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll be back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news.